What if almost everything you learned about World War I leaves out the real engine driving the story? Most of us were taught that it began when an Austrian archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo, but saying the war started because Franz Ferdinand was shot is like saying the Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg. Technically true, but it ignores the far more important question. Why was the ship in that position in the first place? What if the real trigger wasn't a murder in the Balkans, but a financial system that had already pushed Europe's empires to the edge of bankruptcy decades before a single shot was fired? What if the assassination was simply the pretext the great powers needed to deal with a debt crisis that threatened to tear their empires apart? In this video, I want to show you how soaring government debts turned political rivalries into financial obligations, and how the Great War can be viewed as the most expensive debt consolidation scheme in human history. The story starts back in the 1850s, when European elites discovered a new magic trick. You could borrow your way to empire much faster than you could conquer your way to it. Instead of slowly expanding and paying as they went, governments realized they could tap global capital markets and pull future wealth into the present. Britain led this revolution. It raised enormous loans to cover railway construction across India, build coaling stations and naval bases on 6 continents, and sustain the biggest navy and one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. The model was straightforward: borrow heavily, expand rapidly, and count on imperial revenues and trade to make the debt manageable. As long as the empire kept growing and producing new income streams, the math looked beautiful, but that math had a time bomb inside it. By 1914, Britain's national debt had swollen to around $650 million. That figure alone wasn't fatal, but it demanded meticulous management of interest payments, constant refinancing, and uninterrupted access to global credit. France, Germany, and Russia copied this formula. They too borrowed aggressively to fund railways, ports, colonial armies, and naval programs. They thought they were playing a game of territory and prestige. In reality, they had tied themselves into a game of compound interest. To see how this works, think about a mortgage. When you buy a house, you carefully check if you can handle the monthly payments, you worry about interest rates, and you try not to borrow more than your future income can handle. Now imagine that all your neighbors are buying bigger houses, adding extensions, and buying vacation homes, and you feel pushed to match them so you don't fall behind. That is essentially what happened to Europe's great powers. Replace house with battle fleet, colonial army, and overseas territory, and you get the basic picture. Each new dreadnought, each new colony, each expansion of the army meant more money borrowed from bankers who expected to be repaid with interest. Germany is the clearest example of this imperial debt spiral. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Berlin went on a borrowing binge. It tried to challenge British naval superiority, construct railways and infrastructure throughout Africa, and carve out its own colonial sphere in the Pacific all at once. German policymakers convinced themselves that every new overseas possession would eventually finance itself through resource extraction, trade, and taxes. The logic should sound familiar. It's almost identical to the mindset behind the housing bubble of 2008. The belief that rising asset values and future income would always cover today's debt. If you want to see what happens when this logic breaks down, look at the Ottoman Empire. It was the preview trailer for the fate awaiting overleveraged empires. In 1875, the Ottoman government defaulted on its debts, which had reached roughly $200 million. At that point, more than half of its annual revenue went just to interest payments. European lenders didn't shrug and walk away. Instead, they created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a kind of international collection agency with sovereign powers. Foreign bondholders gained direct control over certain Ottoman taxes and customs revenues. In practice, this meant an empire that still ruled territory on 3 continents became a financial dependency of European banks. The Sultan could still hold ceremonies and issue decrees, but the crucial budget decisions were now effectively made in London, Paris, and Berlin. This wasn't just a bailout. It was a prototype for modern financial colonialism. By the early 20th century, this link between military alliances and financial arrangements was becoming explicit. The Declaration of London in 1914 recognized credit as a formal, essential component of the Anglo-French-Russian partnership. Joining an alliance no longer meant just promising troops. It meant tying your balance sheet to your allies' balance sheets, sharing risks, guaranteeing each other's loans, and making your financial survival dependent on their military success. By 1914, every major European power faced the same trap. They stood on towering piles of debt that seemed manageable only if their economies and empires kept expanding. Yet expanding the empire required more military spending and more borrowing, which pushed debts even higher. The system wasn't just strained, it was mathematically unstable. Something had to change. Either these states discovered a way to massively increase revenue, or they faced default and political upheaval. War offered both a justification and a possible exit. Victory promised access to defeated enemies' territories, resources, and reparations. Military necessity gave governments cover to borrow sums that would have been politically unacceptable in peacetime. Most importantly, war allowed governments to rewrite their financial relationships with their own citizens and with foreign creditors. Drafts, new taxes, capital controls, and inflationary finance all became easier to implement under the banner of national emergency. Those emperors and ministers weren't simply enlarging empires, they were enlarging balance sheets stuffed with liabilities that would eventually devour everything they claimed to protect. By 1916, the financial reality behind the war effort had become almost unbelievable. Britain was no longer just paying for its own armies and fleets. It was underwriting most of the costs of the broader empire, covering all of Italy's war expenses, and financing roughly two-thirds of French and Russian military spending. Think about that. A single country was bankrolling a world war involving dozens of nations. How could this possibly work? The answer lies in a dense network of international banking relationships that rarely show up in school textbooks, but quietly determined how long each country could keep fighting. To understand just how deep this ran, ask one simple question. Why was J.P. Morgan Jr., an American banker coordinating European military supply contracts 2 years before the United States officially entered the war? In 1915, Morgan organized a syndicate of around 2,200 American banks to issue a $500 million loan to the Allied powers. But this wasn't just a giant check. The key condition was that virtually all British munitions purchases had to go through Morgan-controlled firms. That gave American bankers direct leverage over Allied procurement. At that point, you have to ask, if a foreign banking house controls your supply chain for guns, shells, and ships, how sovereign are you really? Britain, an empire that still ruled a quarter of the globe, had effectively outsourced its war finance to Wall Street. The Lion was borrowing money from the Eagle to pay for bullets. Meanwhile, as European governments kept tapping capital markets, the cost of borrowing rose. Higher interest rates meant that simply maintaining existing debt levels became more expensive. Expansion wasn't just politically attractive, it was rapidly turning into a mathematical requirement. New conquests and new sources of income were needed just to service old loans. France and Russia were in an especially precarious situation. Their gold reserves, which had once overshadowed those of the Bank of England, suddenly became critical bargaining chips in alliance talks. When leaders discussed mutual defense, they weren't only talking about troop numbers. They were committing to keep each other solvent. Germany followed a slightly different but equally dangerous path. Its central bank, the Reichsbank, provided short-term credit to the state, while periodic war loans consolidated debts into longer-term instruments. Financial historians now see this as an early form of debt monetization. The government was, in effect, creating money to pay interest on money it had already borrowed, all to fund campaigns that were supposed to yield enough spoils to repay everything later. Sound familiar? It's the same structural logic as the 2008 financial crisis, but instead of mortgage-backed securities, you had what we could call victory-backed securities. Each new offensive was expected to pay for itself through captured resources, trade advantages, and reparations. Overlapping all of this were the great merchant banking houses of London Rothschild, Baring, Morgan, Kleinvort, Schroeder. They dominated international investment flows and had enormous stakes in the outcome of European wars. These institutions weren't neutral service providers. Their bond holdings and loan portfolios depended on particular governments surviving, winning, and paying up. To put that in modern terms, imagine if major global banks Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, had lent billions to several different sides in the same regional conflict, and the repayment terms depended on who actually won. Now, add the detail that these same banks also dominated the arms trade to those warring states. Would they really be neutral? Or would they have powerful incentives to shape the outcome? That is exactly what the European financial system looked like between 1914 and 1918. International lending had created a mesh of mutual dependence where creditor nations had a direct interest in their debtors' battlefield performance. When Britain lent money to France and Russia, British banks weren't just worried about balance sheets. They were betting on Allied victory. When German banks fueled Austrian and Ottoman operations, they were making mirrored bets on the Central Powers. Under those conditions, a military defeat didn't just mean diplomatic embarrassment or border changes. It meant total financial meltdown. Defaults on foreign loans, exclusion from global credit markets, and the kind of externally imposed economic control that had already crushed the Ottomans. By 1916, shortages of credit and rising interest rates had turned territorial expansion into the only strategy that seemed capable of staving off bankruptcy. The war was no longer primarily about glory, nationalism, or strategy. It was about avoiding the financial equivalent of foreclosure. The result was a conflict that spiraled into total war. Limited peace deals and modest gains were no longer enough. Each side needed overwhelming victory to extract enough reparations and control enough resources to appease its creditors. Anything short of that implied future insolvency. The human cost was catastrophic. But the incentive structure created by the banking system made peace riskier than continued fighting for heavily indebted states. When your government's survival depends on rolling over debts, and your ability to borrow depends on convincing investors you can win, choosing peace can look like choosing financial suicide. This brings us to the part of the story that completely reshapes how you think about America's role in World War I. You've probably heard the official line, "The United States tried to stay neutral until unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Zimmerman telegram forced our hand." That's the civics textbook version. The financial version revolves around J.P. Morgan Jr. and one of the largest private risk bets in history. Picture Morgan in 1915 in his Wall Street office, studying maps of Europe. Those red pins marking the Western Front, the Eastern Front, the Dardanelles, they didn't just mark battles. They marked places where American money was flowing into artillery, uniforms, ships, and food. By that point, Morgan's syndicate had arranged about $1.5 billion in loans to the Allies, something like $35 billion in today's money. But again, it wasn't just the scale, it was the structure. Morgan and his partners weren't merely creditors. Through their control over Allied purchasing in the U.S., they were effectively managing Britain's and France's war shopping lists from New York. Their profits depended on the war continuing long enough and ending decisively enough in the Allies' favor for those loans to be repaid with interest. That gave some of the most powerful financiers in America a clear stake against early peace negotiations that might stop the fighting without delivering the kind of victory needed to settle the debts. By 1917, this had escalated beyond private finance. The U.S. Treasury itself was granting large loans directly to European governments. Altogether, the United States extended more than $10 billion in credit to foreign states during the war, catapulting itself from a net debtor position of about $3.2 billion in 1914 to the world's leading creditor by 1918. Notice the timing. The Federal Reserve System, America's central bank, was created in 1913, just 1 year before the war began. The Fed provided the institutional mechanism for expanding the money supply and coordinating the banking system in a way that made this huge wave of international lending possible. Without it, the scale of American financing would have been far more limited. In practice, by 1917, American neutrality had become almost impossible. U.S. banks and the federal government had lent so much to the Allies that a German victory would have unleashed a massive financial crisis in the United States. Morgan and his peers didn't just prefer an Allied victory. They needed it to prevent collapse. Think of it like this. You loan your entire life savings to a friend who gets into a fight. If your friend loses, the money is gone. If your friend wins, you get everything back with interest. Are you going to stay neutral in that fight? Or are you eventually going to step in on your friend's side? That's roughly the position the United States found itself in by the time it entered the war. The shift from bystander to combatant wasn't just about moral outrage. It was about protecting an enormous financial exposure that had become too big to fail. Meanwhile, as Europe bled itself dry in the trenches, American industrial output boomed. The flood of Allied orders for weapons, food, coal, and raw materials transformed the U.S. from a peripheral power into the center of the global financial system. Morgan and other American financiers had stumbled on a brutally effective model: profit from European self-destruction. They weren't just financing a war, they were financing the transfer of global economic dominance from European capitals to Wall Street. Every shell fired at Verdun, every tank rolling across Flanders, every ship sunk in the North Sea represented money moving from European treasuries to American banks. The tragedy is that millions of European soldiers were dying in the mud while faraway creditors calculated yields on war bonds. By the time U.S. troops doughboys arrived in large numbers in 1917, their mission was framed in terms of defending democracy. But on a balance sheet level, they were also securing the repayment of debts that European governments owed to American lenders. The real magnitude of this arrangement only becomes clear when you look at what happened after the guns fell silent. The armistice didn't bring financial calm. It opened the door to the largest debt workout the world had ever seen, disguised as a peace process. By 1919, Britain's national debt had jumped from roughly $760 million before the war, often cited as about $76 million in older accounting conventions, to around $7,481 million. France, Germany, and others experienced comparable explosions in their public debts, locking them into repayment schedules that would dominate politics for generations. But what really matters is the pattern of money flows that emerged after the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was obligated to pay huge reparations to Britain and France. Germany couldn't raise that money domestically, so it turned to loans primarily from American banks. Britain and France then used these German-funded reparations to pay down their own war debts to the United States. From a distance, this looks like reparations. Up close, it's a circular debt machine. American banks lent to Germany. Germany paid reparations to Britain and France used those funds to service their obligations to the U.S. creditors who had financed the war in the first place. Between 1919 and 1932, Germany paid about 19 billion gold marks in reparations. Over that same period, it borrowed roughly 27 billion gold marks from foreign lenders, mostly Americans. Germany was taking on more debt than it was paying out, but the reparations framework gave foreign powers legal leverage over its internal economic policies. The Treaty of Versailles, in this light, wasn't primarily a peace agreement. It was a structured debt collection system that placed European economies under sustained financial supervision, with American institutions at the top of the pyramid. European leaders understood more of this than you might think. During the war, they had borrowed under the assumption that they were defending civilization in a shared cause. Afterward, they discovered that American creditors viewed these loans simply as business investments to be repaid on commercial terms. That mismatch in expectations shaped international relations for decades. European governments hoped for partial debt forgiveness or favorable renegotiation out of solidarity. American lenders demanded full repayment plus interest. When the two positions collided, social spending, reconstruction, and domestic welfare repeatedly lost out to debt service. The longevity of these obligations is staggering. Germany didn't make its final World War I-related payment until October 3, 2010. Britain continued servicing aspects of its war debts until 2006. France didn't finish until 2009. That means people born long after the trenches were abandoned spent their working lives paying taxes that went, in part, to settle bills run up by governments that had vanished before their grandparents were even born. The shooting stopped in 1918, but the financial architecture built around the war kept redistributing wealth for nearly a century. It created a global system in which servicing sovereign debt often took precedence over domestic needs, no matter who won elections or what citizens wanted. Meanwhile, the institutions that had orchestrated this arrangement, the major banks and financial houses, emerged more powerful than ever. World War I gave them a blueprint. use emergencies, especially wars, to create large-scale government borrowing that then locks countries into long-term payment streams. That pattern repeats throughout the 20th century. Wars and crises justify emergency loans. Those loans evolve into chronic debt burdens. To reassure creditors, governments implement austerity, privatization, and other policies that often hurt ordinary people, but preserve the flow of interest payments. Seen this way, World War I wasn't just a clash of empires. It was the moment when international conflict was fully integrated into a debt-based global financial system. Military confrontations became opportunities to create new, long-lived financial claims. That's why, even today, sovereign debt crises tend to produce similar outcomes: spending cuts, social unrest, and strict conditions imposed by international lenders. That's why peace talks so often revolve around financial terms as much as borders or political concessions. And that's why, again and again, governments appear more afraid of default than of social breakdown. Those elegantly dressed statesmen signing documents in marble halls in the early 1900s weren't just drawing new borders. They were signing loan agreements, bond issues, and credit guarantees that would outlive them by generations. They thought they were securing the future of their empires. In reality, they were binding their countries and eventually the world into a system where debt service outranks almost everything else. The war to end all wars didn't end war. It helped make war and the debts used to finance it, a permanent and profitable feature of the international order. Since 1918, major conflicts have repeatedly followed the same pattern: huge emergency borrowing, long-term financial obligations, and the steady transfer of wealth from taxpayers to creditors. We don't just inhabit a world shaped by who won past wars. We live in a world shaped by the financial deals that paid for them. And in that sense, the bankers didn't just survive World War I, they won it. And we are still living with the bill.